before we get started, one thing I wanted to sort of say is actually the way, it's 1776 at least, we use the term regulatory hacking events exactly the way you applied it.
Yeah.
The essence of hacking is how do you figure out the most creative way to get something done as efficiently as possible.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's not the blunt force aspect of let's run a massive campaign. It's often going, hey, you know what, if we just go have a friendly conversation with the right people, we can get some stuff done. But I
think, by the way, just following, it's a great point. Like, you know, you think about like coders, like the really great, like using fewer lines of code to accomplish the same thing.
That's exactly right. What's the most efficient?
It's a good metaphor.
I wanted to share just sort of a couple of little anecdotes to sort of frame this discussion. So the first, probably about a year ago, I was having dinner with a venture capitalist up in New York, and I was explaining our whole thesis at 1776. And he goes, no, you know what, we won't deal with any sort of regulatory risk in any investments you make. And I said, really? And he goes, well, there was one company, we invested in a drone startup that's doing three-dimensional scans of cities for advertising purposes. And I was, no, there's no possible regulatory impact there. There's no one who could object to saying drones through cities. The second, sort of metaphor I guess I would use is hearing from someone we had a big event with Uber last week over at our campus. It was interesting because someone sort of made an offhand comment while they were there where they said, you know, the interesting challenge is that every time we run that playbook, right, where we get into issues with policymakers and we get all of our customers engaged and they all send in all these emails to their council members and we fire everybody up. But like every time we do it, it requires more and more and more emails to get the same effect. Yeah. Right? Like there's almost sort of a diminishing return, which I thought was interesting. You know, so within this lens of it's harder and harder to find startups that are doing interesting things that aren't starting to tackle regulatory spaces, figuring this stuff out is pretty critical. And Uber is kind of the paradigmatic example that everybody thinks of now, particularly in the Valley, right? The third anecdote for me, I was talking to a venture capitalist in the Valley, and he was like, you know, the Valley assumes now, in a lot of cases, that if you just raise enough capital, you can just sort of crush that entire opposition stack. Yeah. Right? You can overcome whatever opposition you need if you just have sort of enough money behind it. And, you know, I don't think that's necessarily right. But let's start with Uber. Like, let's use the Uber case study as sort of what could they have done differently? Did they do it right? Did they not do it right? Were they the smartest regulatory hackers out there? I know you sort of teed that one up a little bit. Yeah, I think, so I'm not entirely arm's length on that one. I think so it's like a what if scenario. Yeah. So like, I think Tim and I sort of think similarly on this stuff. I don't know enough yet about Nicole, but we see each other like every day. Never talk about work stuff, but kids are in the same class. Yeah. So you might say, like, can we create state preemptions very early on to bar municipal activity that would block Uber? So where do you go? Like, you look at like tourism and economic development authorities at the state level. Like taxi commissions, not very influential in many state legislatures. Very influential at the city level. Very influential at the municipal level, right? Like, so. And again, it varies place by place. But if you, like, the pitch you might make is like, you know, Albany, Des Moines, like you have, no offense, like on Albany, but you have a set of like, you know, sort of second tier cities or third tier cities that are like, that are in terms of size, not quality, but that are competing for, like the insurance brokers convention, right? Like, and they care a lot about whether they have enough hotel rooms, whether they have restaurants, what the status of like public transportation is. So you might, like, again, like pulling a card out of like Tim's playbook, you might look at, you know, what's the state economic development rationale for like prohibiting the blockage of easier access to rapid transportation to, you know, like second tier cities, and you might highlight the scoring rubrics that search committees and site selection committees. There's all sorts of things that you might do, but in Uber, in fact, in hindsight, I think now moving more aggressively toward things like state preemption and other types of strategies, but that wasn't the play early on. Right. The classic Uber play early on was you you kind of, you go in, you interpret regulations generously in your behalf, you wait until you try to get shut down, but you have this massively addicted consumer base that's willing to sort of rally.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you told me like 10 years ago, like your wife was gonna hail some random dude who was unlicensed to your house in like his Toyota Tercel and like, you know, drive her down to 14th Street to meet you for dinner, I would say there's no good restaurants on 14th Street. But like, you know, but then I would have said, you know, that's crazy, right? So I mean, those guys are all really smart. So I wouldn't second guess them.
I think Uber, there's part consciousness. There's also part situational, and you know they started off with the idea of a national footprint, but started off on a regional basis. And I think if you probably talk to some of the early stage people, they'd tell you when they went in those rooms, the door got slammed pretty hard
Yep.
from the taxi commissions, and they went back and went, wow, this is going to be tough. So I think they probably looked at this and said, and it is a disruptive type of, approach. And I think they made the decision at that point in time that it's better to kind of roll out, pick up market share, in some ways almost ask forgiveness rather than permission, because you know you're going to encounter all these regulatory issues along the way, and go out and put a stake in the ground and pick up that market share and sort some of this stuff out later. Because if they're not unlike where Amazon used to be. They are not a profitable company, right? So let's hope maybe one day they are. But you know, you see the same thing going on right now in cloud services. Companies are, for the government side, they're picking up market share, and contracts are going out and things like that. There's a lot of protocol that hasn't even been decided upon. That's not bad necessarily. Government in some cases needs to be caught up. Government's not going to be a leader with some of the best technologists around cloud in terms of security and things like that. That begs to where 21st century regulation, you'd hope it would go. It's not there yet though.
The only thing I would add, it's an interesting question, what could they have done differently? And I think your description of how users felt in a market that they were addicted to the product is perfect. It is a sense of addiction. But I think initially users loved the convenience, and that's what they came stampeding out, demanding to retain. I think what Uber could have done differently is anticipated where they would have been vulnerable optically around safety, and had a bigger movement initially of strategic alliances across safety. So have MAD come out, have Take Back the Night communities come out, and be sort of part of the initial discussion about kind of validating the product from in preparation for where they would be vulnerable.
It's interesting if you look at that though. If you look at the evolution of, for lack of a better term, their story, right? Their story has evolved. So their story has gone from convenience to now they're trying to roll. I use the example of New York State as an example. They're now running ads all across every city in New York State. And it's not only just about the convenience of, you talk about the user convenience, it's about economic development.
Economic development.
And it's about, you're creating some type of scalable, it is that gig economy that is very, very new and very hard for some people in government to understand.
That was absolutely the story, David Plouffe was really telling when he was out last week, was now this is about the fact that we're creating flexible work on demand for people who most need it, and the average Uber driver makes something like an average of $400 a month. He's pointing out for a lot of these people, $400 at the margin is the difference between making ends meet that month or not. Very, very, very different story than what they were originally telling.
And back to the point about storytelling, I mean, the driver stories are so incredibly compelling, and we've all had the experience being in the car. I mean, I have been, in cars with people who are using the additive income to complete a graduate degree. It's so inspiring, and I think it's all driven by economic development. And now they know that those stories are incredibly valuable. So this is a hindsight question. If they'd had a crystal ball, maybe earlier on those stories would have started coming out.
So we threw out a lot of terms during the Power Talks. Wanted to kind of go through and see how you guys might define some of these terms and how they're relevant to startups. Because a lot of this stuff are sort of terms of art that, that you all know but don't necessarily resonate with a startup. So one of the very first things, whenever you talk about anything involving government or government affairs, people automatically assume you're talking about lobbying. So in the simplest sense, what's lobbying and when do you think that actually is relevant for a startup?
So lobbying is like speeding, right? Like it's not my opinion as to what constitutes lobbying, and people are really, I think people are really wrong-headed on this oftentimes, right? So like, you know, if you're driving down the road in a Ferrari with like really nice Z-rated tires and you happen to be a race car driver, but you're going like 85 in a 55 zone, you're still speeding, right? Like it's objectively true. So like if you're, you know, so lobbying is defined at the municipal level.
So what's lobbying?
So it depends, right? It depends on where you are. So like in, you know, in the state of Illinois, when I contacted the executive director of the Commission on Higher Education, who I knew, who's a terrific guy who had worked in higher ed for a long time, and said, would you like to, you know, meet with General Assembly to talk about what they're doing in the state, and made a strong economic development rationale, like that required me to register with the state in advance, which is totally reasonable, right? Because as a taxpayer, you want to know like who's communicating with your public officials and how much are they being paid and by who, and so in some states it's a very light touch. If you're building goodwill on behalf of a brand, that constitutes lobbying, right? In other states, if you have to be engaging on a very specific type of like legislative or regulatory activity. In other states, it has to be there are time or monetary thresholds. At the federal level, it has to be 20% of the time of the total amount of time you're spending on behalf of a particular client for the most part. So it depends on where you're operating, but
in the simplest sense, it's when you or someone is directly talking to a policymaker or a government official.
Yeah, when you're being paid to say something on behalf of somebody else to a public official.
Yeah, you'd say it's a set intent to shape some type of regulatory or procurement initiative, either in a proactive way or in a protective way for your client. And different states, I mean, to Ben's point, different states have different thresholds. Some states, you can't even go in and talk to anybody. Other states, the threshold is, a little bit less. I think you'll talk to most practitioners and they'll tell you the do no harm principle, and you're going to probably always want to protect yourself and register and be transparent on those things as a business. It's just the best way to go.
So where have you seen sort of, in some of the case studies maybe you guys put forward in your Power Talks, where have you seen sort of direct lobbying be relevant? That would be some of the examples where you were going out and directly talking to some of the regulators for General Assembly, for example, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know I suppose there are certain situations where you want to shape the perspective of regulators, either like sort of a priori or like after once you know what their position is, and you would want to do that through the media, which by the way in some states is lobbying, right? So in some states, if you're writing and placing an op-ed or you're encouraging people to email, it doesn't have to be like, it doesn't even have to be face-to-face communications, so again, it varies. Like I think it's hard to engage in a thoughtful and productive way with regulators, using the term broadly, policymakers, without communicating with them, right, in this day and age.
It's interesting the way we sort of pair up with lobbying. At our firm, we don't lobby, but we tend to work in conjunction with firms that are lobbying. And we will often create those communications products that are attempting to condition the environment for greater success when the lobbying teams come in. And sometimes we'll collaborate to try and create the language that goes into the value proposition for these meetings in a way that is a bit more imbibed with storytelling or, again, emotion. And in doing it that way, we tend to sort of get just to the left or the right of the definition of lobbying.
There's other strategies that goes into what you talked about in your presentation about kind of ancillary to corporate social responsibility, where a company will engage, or a group will engage in what's called thought leadership. They're not going to go in there and talk to a specific person about this bill or something like that, but they are going to bring people in maybe from an industry perspective or from a technology perspective, and just talk about how here's what other states are doing in terms of a best practice policy. And if you care about the consumers and you actually want to look down the line, here's some studies. Not our studies, this was done by Georgetown. Here's a study about, what happens when you open up the cloud and you do certain protocol. So that level of thought leadership is less lobbying and more where you're going in there, you're not asking them for anything. And in many cases, what I think we have all found when we've been in those positions in front of these legislators, the reality of that stigma around lobbying is that these legislators, their staff turns over, they want information. They're interested to hear this, particularly if it's third party, and they can look at it and they can give it to their staff and validate it.
So another term that gets tossed, or terms that get tossed around, is sort of the grassroots. How do you get all those Uber users out there, rally up and support? And then the idea of grass tops. Do you guys want to talk about sort of some examples you've seen of using those and define those terms a little bit for our students here?
Yeah, sure. We have a term that we use that sort of sits nicely with grass tops, which is government and those that influence government. And so how do you define who influences government? And always it depends on what your project is and what your subject matter is. But it tends to be, leading issue organizations that are in that space, or it may be a clutch of local lawmakers that really have the ear of the lawmaker you're trying to reach, or maybe it's a highly empowered kind of regulatory team at a municipality level. Whomever it is that influences your end destination, that's sort of how we tend to define grass tops. And then grassroots is more of your civic engagement, and that's sort of riders for Uber or voters.
And are there other example, guys?
Just to carry on, the grass tops would be, we like to think of it in terms of, you look at an issue and you look at the decision makers around, you draw circles. So grass tops are, who are the key stakeholders and influencers around this? The people that are going to be, A, decision maker, B, someone that's going to be helping shape this, and C, maybe a thought. Who are those people that are the stakeholders around this that you want to get to, and educating and informing them could be impactful on your issues. The grassroots is, as Nicole said, much more about really kind of educating and unleashing citizens to call in directly to say, hey, I'm earning $400 a month, or hey, I use this service and it's more affordable for me than the yellow cab. Or then you get into a whole other array of social issues around cabs and things of that nature that we don't need to go into, but you can drive grassroots on a very segmented issue if you need to.
Cool. So you also talked, Tim, about the idea of kind of coalition building. And you used that example specifically. You wouldn't think initially that doctors and nurses care a lot about smoke alarms, right? But in the end, that was part of your coalition. So why is it useful to sort of bring these different groups together?
Yeah, that's the ecosystem of, because I think every time you're involved in something like this, you want to look at what are the relevant coalitions that touch it. It can be, if it's an issue, I was in the classroom for a little bit earlier, and they were talking about identity theft. So your circle around identity theft could be everything from just spitballing it here, right? It could be AARP. Yeah, AARP. Demographics of identity theft, it's usually older people. Suddenly, they care about this. And then you start looking at state CIOs. They're worried about their records getting hacked. So suddenly you begin to build coalitions around people that will care, will take action, and they will inevitably become advocates for you, or they will be references on this issue.
One of the things that I think was interesting, the sort of the Uber examples, a lot of sort of older style technology companies interacting with government were always sort of about staying out of the way of the innovator, right? Fundamentally, what Uber's going is we want to do what we want, and could you keep your regulation out of the way? But a number of the examples you guys used was how do you actually use, government proactively, in your case, to sort of help get the carbon monoxide into market faster with lower cost of customer acquisition. In your case, really just, the interesting thing with the hand-up example is government's not a client, government's not even changing regulation. Hand-up's just being very good at using mayors' convening power to get the stakeholders quickly around the table to let them kind of enter markets.
Well, and they're also creating something of value. They're creating something of value long-term for local government agencies. One of the things that Hand Up talks about is that the data, so the technology that they have built, that they share with the nonprofits that they work with, they are actually providing a solution for nonprofits that nonprofits don't currently have. And some of the government servicing agencies that are working with the homeless population. One thing that Rose had said to me, which I didn't know before I learned about her business, is that it's very challenging for cities to simply catalog and hold data on homeless individuals. And so the platform she's building solves that problem. And while it isn't her short-term business goal, it's certainly easy to see how that could be of great value to local governments.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that certainly the entrepreneurs that we work with are the education, sort of health and wellness space are solving for a social problem, right? Like some right, and that's typically a policy challenge. So if you're thinking about entrepreneurship or startups or using the corporate form to sort of like aggregate capital to address like complex social or challenges, then like it's inherently like political. Like it's inherent, like government is the private sector rather sort of like the third leg of the stool is solving problems that better, smarter, cheaper, faster.
Government has an inherent public policy interest in making sure an educated workforce is regularly.
Yeah, and capital is increasingly flowing toward so you had that conversation with a VC. Capital is increasingly flowing toward big, complex problems, right? And which are again inherently sort of the externalities associated with solving those problems are public, right? And that's the point. So they're inherently political, inherently intertwined with policy.
But we used an example of where you used a lot of these strategies, sort of regular tracking strategies, to help grow a market and create a market. We used an example where you use them to simply help storytelling and convening and bringing coalitions together. The Uber example is very much keeping people out. What's interesting about the example you used with General Assembly is, did the fact that General Assembly was able to understand how to engage with regulators and build that, is that sort of a third or a fourth category where they were able to sort of build a sort of barrier to entry around their business as they scaled? Does it make it harder for other competitors to enter the market who don't understand how to engage with those players?
I think once I don't know, we'll see.
Yeah.
I think, there's a certain, I think General Assembly was able to develop organizational capacity and sort of institutional knowledge that enabled them to manage to what could have otherwise been regulatory risk. They didn't overreact, so that was enabled them to more prudently use corporate resources. Did our other providers in a disadvantageous position? Probably not, but I think they're certainly in the, because they're licensed, because they complied with the law, because they developed an organizational capacity and sophistication in how to sort of interact with government. I think they're certainly more credible as we think about the formulation of policy that affects that sector.
It's interesting, it's kind of the classic narrative around this stuff. You sort of talked about a little bit of the ideology of startups and, government's a problem. The part of the ideology you hear so much of is the idea that, regulation all just exists to protect rent seekers.
Yeah.
It's big taxi that you're fighting against. It's big whatever. In your cases, do you think that's true, or do you think it's a sort of easy trope to put up there when you're trying to sort of get past laws that are inconvenient?
Yeah. I mean, I view the policy, that's not what I view. Like, the policy environment is by definition mutable. It evolves, right? Like, all the time, right? So like the, we have textbook adoption policies at the state level that were put in place for fairly good reasons, right? And they today sort of dictate in some places what types of materials school districts are able to buy. Like, I don't think those are horrible policies. I think those were policies that were put in place with a purpose at a certain point in time, and they'll evolve and erode and build up, and so
this isn't all the McGraw-Hill oligopoly just using state laws to protect their.
Well, they're in a rent-seeking position right now, right? Like, they have a business, or have historically had a business model. It's not just McGraw-Hill, but you certainly, these things shift over time, right? Like, and the policies that we're championing on behalf of startups today will, policies sort of, it's mutable, but they sort of calcify around business models, and business models calcify around policy, and then they need to change over time.
Before you know it, General Assembly is the 800-pound gorilla,
Right.
using their knowledge of the
Totally.
regulatory process to protect
Yeah, these things
boot camps from digital boot camps, and Uber is all of a sudden the 800-pound gorilla that's complaining about people
there's a
investing
ways
in
off, but
monopoly.
yeah.
It is cool. I mean, like, if you think about it, if you just throw out some of the examples we talked about, right? How do you protect people from carbon monoxide? How do you address homelessness issues? How do you make sure that you actually have an educated workforce? Even Blake's talk earlier today, right? Like, how do we actually create a sort of national digital identification platform? I mean, these are problems that in a previous generation you might have assumed that government was supposed to kind of come in and solve themselves. Yeah. And now you're in an environment where we sort of assume that startups are developing innovative things to solve these problems, which is great, but to your point, really, really hard to do it without very active engagement with those people who are responsible for a lot of the externalities involved.
That's
in
right.
So also with sometimes with unintended consequences from the entrepreneur side, and by that I mean, part of this economy is so driven in the fluidity of it with apps and things where you create something and then suddenly you realize this is great, this is a great enabler, and you test it, your users are like, this is fantastic, and then suddenly you dive into it, and 3 weeks later you find out that you have labor issues, workers' comp issues, insurance issues, fair right wage issues, you have some social issues, so it may not have ever been intended in that fashion, but the reality is, for good or for bad, government has promulgated legislation and regulation to have some protections, and you're intersecting with that. And the strong survive, the ones that push through and change this, it evolves, policy evolves. There's a whole segment of our country that couldn't vote. And in a not too distant past, and it seemed okay for a lot of people apparently. That's not the case anymore. The country, things evolve. I know that's a draconian, extreme example, but my point is, these things change.
Some might say we're seeing a bit of backsliding there anyway.